So in this lecture, we will try to reconcile the Keynesian and the neoclassical views on macroeconomy. Before we start, let's start with some of the differences between Keynesians and neoclassicals. For example, Keynesians view prices and wages are sticky, whereas neoclassicals believe that prices and wages are flexible. Keynesian believe that short-run aggregate supply curve horizontal up to the potential GDP and then vertical at potential GDP, whereas neoclassicals believe that short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping with prices. Keynesian believe that recession primarily caused by decreasing AD or aggregate demand below potential GDP, whereas the classicals or neoclassicals believe that recession primarily caused by shifts in short-run aggregate supply below potential GDP. And that's the reason often neoclassicals are called supply side, whereas Keynesians are often known as demand side economics, because Keynesians believe in the importance of aggregate demand in causing recessions, whereas neoclassicals believe is the aggregate supply. And remember, according to neoclassicals and Say's law, supply creates its own demand, whereas Keynesians believe demand creates its own supply. Keynesians believe that economy may stuck in below potential GDP level for extended period of time, which essentially means that if we are in recession, we can stay in recession for really long time simply because there's not enough demand to reach up to the potential GDP. Neoclassicals believe that economy always self-adjusts due to flexible wages and prices, and that's the reason in the long run we will always be at the potential GDP. Finally, Keynesians believe strong role of policy intervention to increase aggregate demand and as a result to control recessions, whereas neoclassicals believe policy is irrelevant. Minimum intervention in free market is what is desirable. That's why often neoclassicals believe there should be less government and more market. So government intervention or policy intervention should be at the minimum level. So these are some of the differences between Keynesians and neoclassicals. Now the question is this: how do we reconcile these two views? Now, two are extreme views, and often the reality is somewhere in between. And using an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, I'll show you how two views can be reconciled. Let me first draw an aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is little different from the Keynesian version that you have seen before. So I'll draw a short-run aggregate supply which is flat initially, then it eventually start going up. So it's kind of flat and then it start going up. This is your short-run aggregate supply. I'll draw the potential GDP, which is long-run aggregate supply. And next I'll draw the aggregate demand. I'll draw three aggregate demand to show you the differences between the Keynesian and the neoclassical. So first is the aggregate demand through the long run situation. So this is the aggregate demand through the long run. Then I'll draw one more aggregate demand, which is then I'll draw one more aggregate demand, which is I will draw one more aggregate demand, which is in this upward sloping section. So I'll just name it E1, these are different equilibriums, E2, 3. Now we all know that in Keynesian world, short-run aggregate supply curve is flat below the potential GDP. However, when we reconcile these views, yes, short-run aggregate supply in Keynesian world is flat, but it is flat when output is way below the potential. So at E1, you can see, so this portion is Keynesian. So portion of SRAS curve where GDP is far below potential and SRAS curve is flat, that's the Keynesian portion. Where is the neoclassical portion? In the neoclassical portion, your short-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. So neoclassical portion is, or this is your neoclassical zone. And what's between E1 and E3? So neoclassical zone portion of the SRAS curve where GDP is at or near potential output, where SRAS curve is steep, which is kind of rising really fast. So between E1 and E3 is our intermediate zone. So this is our portion of SRAS curve where GDP is below potential but not so far below as in the Keynesian zone. The SRAS curve is upward sloping but not vertical in the intermediate zone. So this is your intermediate zone, E1 till E3. So this is how we can incorporate all the views or Keynesian and the neoclassical views in a single diagram. And perhaps this is more realistic than perhaps taking an extreme view of Keynesian or extreme view of neoclassicals. We need policies, but having too much policies is also not desirable. And perhaps that's the reality is in a country like the United States. So next I'd like to talk about a little bit about policy intervention. So we all know in the real world, policy makers do intervene in the economy, and that's the reality. And there must be strong reasons for it. And we all know how, because of policy intervention, we were able to come out of Great Depression and also more recent Great Recession. The policy can be divided into two broad categories. First is monetary policy, which basically includes changing money supply and interest rates. And the second is fiscal policy, which includes changing taxes and government expenditure. And we will be discussing both of these in our following lectures. Both monetary policies and fiscal policies are primarily designed to affect aggregate demand. Very important, because most of the policies do not affect short-run aggregate supply or long-run aggregate supply. Policies primarily affect aggregate demand through consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. And we will be talking about each of these policies in our following lectures.